The downfall of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, a royal tragedy. For 1,000 years, the Bourbon dynasty was the undisputed heart of France. Its power was absolute, its splendor unmatched, and its seat was Versailles, a palace built not just of stone and gold, but of divine right and unquestioned authority. The French monarchy represented the pinnacle of European political civilization, a system where the king was accountable only to God. But empires, however mighty, are built upon brittle and ultimately fragile foundations. This is the story of the twilight of the French monarchy, a tale of opulence and ignorance, of love and betrayal, and the violent dawn of a new age. This is the tragic final chapter of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Before the great battles, before the rise of Napoleon, before the empire, there was the revolution, and its engine was the blood of a king and queen. The collapse of the French state was rooted in a profound structural contradiction between the economic dynamism of the nation and the rigidity of its political system. When Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1774, France was already a nation in deep structural peril, crippled by centuries of feudal extravagance and devastating foreign wars. The financial crisis was the most immediate and fatal flaw. The nation was perpetually insolvent, having engaged in costly conflicts throughout the 18th century. The colossal expenditures on the 7 Years' War and, critically, the American War of Independence drained the treasury to the point of terminal bankruptcy. The king's support for the American rebels, a strategic move designed to spite the British, was fiscally suicidal, leading to massive borrowing and spiraling national debt that the monarchy had no effective mechanism to service. Compounding this financial abyss was the disastrous taxation system, a relic of the feudal past. The entire financial burden fell almost exclusively and mercilessly upon the Third Estate, particularly the impoverished peasantry and the burgeoning bourgeoisie. The nobility and the clergy, the two wealthiest estates, enjoyed sweeping exemptions from the main direct taxes, a system of privilege that made any sensible fiscal reform impossible. Any attempt by capable finance ministers like Turgot or Necker to impose taxes on the privileged classes was met with a fierce, unyielding and organized resistance from the powerful regional judicial bodies known as the parliaments. The king possessed absolute power in theory, but was utterly powerless against the stone wall of aristocratic self-interest and entrenched privilege. The system was designed to protect the very class that was pushing the nation toward inevitable ruin. The inevitable collapse was accelerated by the personal deficiencies of the individuals at its center. Louis XVI was an unsuited ruler for the magnitude of the crisis he inherited. He was personally a quiet, amiable, and devout man, more comfortable pursuing his hobbies of locksmithing and hunting than confronting the nation's immense political and financial challenges. His indecisiveness and aversion to confrontation were catastrophic weaknesses. He possessed no firm political will and vacillated constantly between the reactionary demands of the court and the necessity of reform. His failure was not malicious intent, but chronic failure of leadership and lack of nerve. He had the power to save France, but not the will to use it against his own family and class. Beside him stood Marie Antoinette, his Austrian queen. Brought to Versailles as a young teenager, she was unprepared for the intense scrutiny and hostility of the French court and the nation. She became the immediate and enduring symbol of the monarchy's extravagance and foreign origins, a source of deep nationalistic resentment.
Her famous spending on elaborate hairstyles, jewelry, and gambling earned her the cruel and politically devastating nickname Madame Deficit. While the populace struggled with soaring bread prices, the Queen's detached life of luxury at the Petit Trianon only amplified the growing class hatred. The pervasive myth that Antoinette famously suggested, "Let them eat cake," while historically inaccurate, was readily believed by the starving populace. The willingness of the people to accept such a cruel sentiment as true speaks volumes about the complete abyss of understanding and empathy that separated the monarchy from its subjects. The court was an isolated, gilded cage, living in a state of willful ignorance, believing that the poverty of the Third Estate was merely an accounting problem rather than an existential threat to the state. The widespread circulation of libellous pamphlets and rumors, known as the libels, which attacked the Queen's character and morality, further destroyed the last vestiges of popular respect for the monarchy.
The social rigidity of the Ancien regime meant that the dynamic new class of the bourgeoisie, the lawyers, merchants, and financiers who possessed the nation's wealth and intellect, was systematically excluded from political power and social status due to their lack of noble birth. This systematic exclusion turned the most capable and educated segment of French society into the most potent and articulate enemy of the Bourbon monarchy. They demanded not merely economic reforms, but a complete overhaul of the political system based on meritocracy and enlightened principles, a demand that the inflexible aristocracy categorically refused to meet. The stage was set not just for a crisis, but for a revolutionary clash between two completely incompatible worldviews. The ideological framework for the impending collapse was brilliantly provided by the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment. These ideas, circulating widely through literary salons, coffee houses, and mass-produced pamphlets, provided the educated bourgeoisie with the philosophical justification and the clear revolutionary language necessary to dismantle the monarchy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of the general will, the radical idea that sovereignty resides in the collective will of the people rather than the divinely sanctioned monarch, directly undermined the very legitimacy of Louis XVI's rule. John Locke's theories on natural rights and the social contract asserted that the government derived its power from the governed and that all men possessed inherent rights to liberty and property. These profound intellectual weapons armed the revolutionaries with a moral authority that superseded the king's ancient claims. By 1788, the financial abyss was so vast, so terrifying, that King Louis XVI was left with no tenable alternative. All reform efforts had been blocked by the aristocratic Parlement, and the treasury was empty. In a final desperate act of political surrender, he agreed to summon the Estates General, a legislative assembly composed of representatives from the three estates, which had not been convened for 175 years. This decision was the ultimate signal of the monarchy's political failure, a desperate appeal for national help that would instead become the platform for its destruction. The calling of the Estates General immediately exposed the fatal flaw of the Ancien regime, the system of voting by order. The First and Second Estates, though representing only 3% of the population, could always outvote the vast Third Estate 2-1, ensuring that any financial reform that affected privilege would be instantly blocked. The representatives of the Third Estate, primarily composed of the educated and radicalized bourgeoisie, demanded voting by head, which would grant them proportional power. The king and the aristocracy adamantly refused to yield this point, clinging desperately to the mechanism of their ancient privilege, a rigid refusal that ignited the revolution. The political deadlock led directly to the first revolutionary act. On June 20th, 1789, the deputies of the Third Estate, finding themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall, marched to a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they took the famous tennis court oath, solemnly swearing not to disperse until they had drafted and established a new constitution for France. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the true sovereign voice of the nation. This was a direct, unprecedented, and irreversible usurpation of the king's authority. The revolution had begun, not with bloodshed, but with a powerful act of political will and legal defiance. The political defiance of the tennis court oath quickly translated into physical violence on the streets of Paris. Louis XVI, faced with the humiliation of the National Assembly's existence, made a catastrophic and final political miscalculation. He refused to acknowledge the Assembly's legitimacy and instead attempted to assert his authority through force. He ordered loyal troops, primarily foreign mercenary regiments considered more reliable than French soldiers, to concentrate around Paris and Versailles, a clear prelude to dissolving the Assembly and crushing the emerging revolution. This military maneuver confirmed the Parisian populace's worst fears. The king intended to suppress the people's will through bloodshed. The immediate reaction was an explosion of fear and rage, fueled by chronic starvation. Years of poor harvests had pushed the price of bread, a dietary staple for the working poor, to exorbitant and often unreachable levels. Hunger became the physical engine of the revolution's violence. Mobs and crowds began desperately searching for weapons to defend themselves against the expected royal military crackdown. The search for arms culminated on July 14, 1789. The target was the Bastille. This medieval fortress was not just a symbol of arbitrary royal tyranny, where political prisoners were locked away by the king's simple decree, a lettre de cachet. It was also, crucially, the largest single depot of gunpowder and cannonballs in the city. The massive crowd, numbering in the tens of thousands, first overwhelmed the Hôtel des Invalides to seize muskets and cannons, before marching directly to the imposing stone walls of the Bastille. The confrontation at the Bastille was a tactical mess, but a symbolic triumph. The small garrison under Governor Bernard-René Delaunay was inadequate and isolated. The lack of clear orders from Versailles, combined with the sympathy of many French soldiers for the crowd, meant that the king's authority dissolved instantly. After a chaotic and bloody initial exchange of fire, Delaunay, realizing his position was hopeless and having received no sign of the expected royal reinforcements, ordered the fortress to surrender. The subsequent actions revealed the brutality of the revolution's new emotional reality. Delaunay was dragged out through the streets, beaten, lynched, and his head was savagely mounted on a pike. The first symbolic beheading of the Ancien Regime and a terrifying precedent for the violence to come. The military significance of the Bastille's fall was minor, but its symbolic impact was immeasurable. It signaled that the monarchy had completely lost control of its capital, and that the popular will, backed by physical force, was now the supreme authority in France. The king's reaction to this cataclysm was famously detached. His diary entry for July 14, 1789, contained a single word: rien, nothing. A profound indictment of his failure to grasp the magnitude of the revolutionary wave that had just washed over his kingdom. The initial violence of the Bastille's fall quickly forced the monarchy to concede political ground.
But the economic misery continued unabated. The massive urban population of Paris, the sans-culottes, continued to suffer under exorbitant bread prices, while rumors of lavish aristocratic feasts and royal hoarding circulated widely. The people felt the revolution had delivered abstract political rights, but not the tangible necessities of life. This profound economic misery fueled the Women's March on Versailles in October 1789.
A massive crowd, largely composed of market women, the backbone of the Parisian working class, began a torrential march from Paris to the magnificent Palace of Versailles, the ultimate symbol of royal excess and detachment. Their demand was simple and visceral: bread. But their secondary demand was political. They wanted the king and his family removed from their isolated bubble and brought to Paris, where they could be held accountable, and where the royal family could personally witness the true extent of the people's suffering. The march was a terrifying demonstration of popular power. The crowd, swelling in size and rage, eventually overwhelmed the palace guard, breaching the halls of the royal residence. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, a primary target of the mob's hatred, narrowly escaped violence, having been warned just moments before the crowds burst into her private apartments. The king, Louis XVI, faced with the imminent threat of bloodshed against his family and his loyal guards, was forced to make the ultimate concession. He appeared on the balcony and agreed to the people's demands. The royal family was forcibly taken from their ancestral palace and escorted back to Paris, a journey of profound public humiliation. Their carriage was surrounded by the massive armed mob, the heads of 2 slain royal guards raised on pikes leading the procession. The king, the queen, and their children were moved into the dilapidated Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris, effectively becoming prisoners of the nation. The move marked the decisive end of the Ancien Regime's absolute power. The monarchy was now under the direct scrutiny and immediate threat of the revolutionary populace. The king had been stripped of his sovereignty, and the stage was set for the constitutional experiments that would fail spectacularly. The move to the Tuileries Palace initiated a difficult 2-year period where Louis XVI ostensibly accepted the revolutionary changes, agreeing to become a constitutional monarch. The National Assembly worked diligently to draft a constitution that would balance royal authority with popular sovereignty, while the royal family lived under intense scrutiny and virtual house arrest. However, neither Louis nor Marie Antoinette had any genuine intention of adhering to the revolutionary settlement. They viewed the entire process as a temporary humiliation, a dangerous interlude before the restoration of their God-given absolute power. Marie Antoinette, in particular, was actively engaged in secret counter-revolutionary correspondence, urging her brother, Emperor Leopold II of Austria, and other European monarchs to intervene militarily to crush the revolution and restore her husband's absolute throne. The fear among the revolutionaries was immense. They rightly suspected that the king was secretly plotting against the nation. This profound distrust reached its ultimate breaking point with the flight to Varennes in June 1791. The royal family, disguised as common travelers and utilizing forged passports, attempted to secretly flee Paris under the cover of darkness. Their destination was the eastern border,
where they intended to meet with loyalist troops and join the forces of the émigrés, aristocratic French noblemen who had fled the revolution and were organizing an army abroad. The entire escape plan was a masterpiece of arrogance and amateurish execution, marked by excessive delays, the use of conspicuous elaborate carriages, and a catastrophic failure of security. The massive coach was eventually recognized near the small town of Varennes by a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet, who recognized the king's face from his portrait on French paper currency. The alarm was instantly raised. The carriage was immediately surrounded by local National Guardsmen and an enraged crowd. Louis XVI's attempts to assert his authority were met with open derision and resistance. The subsequent journey back to Paris was a slow, agonizing, and final public humiliation. The king, queen, and their children were escorted under guard, surrounded by a massive, silent, and hostile crowd. For the vast majority of the French populace, the flight to Varennes was the definitive proof that Louis XVI was not merely an incompetent ruler, but a traitor, a deceitful enemy actively plotting civil war and foreign invasion against his own people. Any remaining hope for a peaceful constitutional compromise vanished instantly. The monarchy's moral authority was annihilated, and the path was set for the complete abolition of the crown. The final and most decisive factor that guaranteed the success of the revolution and sealed the fate of the monarchy was war. Following the humiliation of Varennes and the pervasive fear that Louis XVI was secretly negotiating with foreign powers, the newly formed Legislative Assembly took the catastrophic step of declaring war on Austria in April 1792.
This decision was driven by the fervent belief that war was the only way to expose the king's treason, rally the nation, and spread the revolutionary ideals across Europe. The war initially went disastrously for France. The French armies, disorganized and lacking experienced aristocratic officers, suffered immediate defeats. The foreign armies, particularly the Prussians, quickly advanced onto French soil. In July 1792, the enemy commander, the Duke of Brunswick, issued the infamous Brunswick Manifesto, which explicitly threatened to inflict an exemplary vengeance upon Paris if the royal family was harmed. This external threat proved fatal to the king. The manifesto was instantly viewed by the Parisian populace as irrefutable proof of Louis XVI's treason, evidence that he was conspiring with the invaders to slaughter his own people and restore his absolute power. The rage and fear of the Parisian populace exploded again. On August 10, 1792, a massive, organized mob, including the radical sans-culottes and National Guardsmen, stormed the Tuileries Palace. The king and his family were forced to flee to the protection of the Legislative Assembly. The loyal Swiss Guard, who fought bravely to defend the king's residence, were utterly overwhelmed and brutally massacred by the mob, their bodies mutilated in the streets. The attack on the Tuileries Palace was the true, violent end of the French monarchy. The Legislative Assembly, under intense pressure from the victorious mob and a powerful Paris Commune, formally suspended the king's authority and effectively abolished the monarchy. The royal family was imprisoned in the heavily guarded Temple Fortress. Louis XVI, who had once held the title by divine right, was now simply known as Citizen Louis Capet. The Republic was born not through calm deliberation, but through immediate, necessary bloodshed, fueled by the overwhelming pressure of foreign invasion and domestic treason. The suspension of the king's authority on August 10, 1792, was immediately followed by the formal declaration of the First French Republic and the urgent necessity of deciding the fate of the former monarch. The National Convention, the new governing body, was deeply divided over the issue. Some moderates argued for exile or imprisonment, but the powerful radical faction, led by the Jacobins and figureheads like Maximilien Robespierre, demanded his blood.
Robespierre argued with chilling logic that Louis XVI could not be tried as a criminal but had to be executed as a political necessity, a sacrifice required to secure the Republic. Louis must die because the fatherland must live, was his uncompromising decree. The trial of citizen Louis Capet began in December 1792, before the National Convention itself, acting as a judicial body. The charges against the former king were extensive: treason, conspiracy against the liberty of the nation, and crimes against the general safety of the state, including his attempts to flee the country and his secret correspondence with foreign enemies. Despite a spirited defense by his lawyers, who tried to argue for his constitutional inviolability, the verdict was predetermined by political passion and fear. The evidence of his duplicity, especially documents discovered in the Iron Chest, a secret safe at the Tuileries Palace, confirming his covert contacts with foreign powers, proved devastating to his cause. The voting on the verdict was tense and agonizing, with deputies often changing their votes multiple times. On January 15, 1793, Louis was overwhelmingly found guilty of conspiracy. The vote on the punishment, however, was much closer, a matter of a few votes determining the course of history. Despite the impassioned arguments of moderates against the death penalty, the convention narrowly voted for death without reprieve or delay. The death sentence was a moment of profound symbolism. It was the decisive public break with the past and a clear, irreversible signal to Europe that the revolution would stop at nothing to defend itself. On the cold morning of January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was driven through the silent, heavily guarded streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution, the former Place Louis XV. He maintained a remarkable dignity on the scaffold, attempting to address the massive crowd. "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to the charge of me. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited upon France," he declared. His voice, however, was quickly drowned out by a deafening roll of drums ordered by General Santerre. The blade of the guillotine fell at 10:22 a.m. The executioner held up the severed head to the massive crowd, and the French monarchy that had lasted 1,000 years ended in a single, bloody, terrifying moment.
The execution of Marie Antoinette followed 9 months later, in October 1793, during the height of the Reign of Terror. Stripped of her grandeur, isolated, and suffering the immense grief of losing her husband and children, she faced her own trial with a profound and unexpected courage that won her grudging respect even from her fiercest enemies. Accused falsely of incest and treason, her guilt was a political formality. She was executed on October 16, 1793, wearing a simple white dress, and driven not in a closed carriage, but in an open cart through the mocking hostile streets of Paris. Her death completed the cycle of vengeance and signaled that the revolutionary machine would spare no one who represented the ancien regime. The royal couple's execution was the ultimate act of revolutionary sovereignty, an unwritten promise that no form of tyranny would ever be tolerated again.
The executions of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were not merely personal tragedies, they were the necessary catalysts for the most brutal phase of the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. Their deaths eliminated the monarchy, but plunged France into a period of extreme political instability, paranoia, and violence, where the revolutionary machine turned on its own creators. The ensuing internal chaos and the external threats from the combined European monarchies, desperate to avenge the royal blood, required a new form of tyranny to restore order and save the Republic. France had eliminated one king, only to find itself adrift in a sea of political fragmentation. The tragic byproduct of the revolution's success was the vacuum of power and the intense demand for a leader capable of commanding absolute authority while claiming revolutionary loyalty. The execution of the royal couple effectively cleared the historical stage, allowing the dramatic emergence of the man who would inherit the revolution's armies and its fierce nationalism. That man was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's subsequent rise was fundamentally enabled by the very chaos that claimed the Bourbons. His military genius at Toulon and his political ruthlessness in Paris were valued precisely because the nation was exhausted by the revolutionary instability that followed the king's death. The French people and the political elite yearned for order, security, and military glory. Napoleon offered these things in abundance.
He successfully channeled the immense energy and nationalistic fervor unleashed by the revolution's violence away from abstract political ideals and toward military conquest and the construction of his personal empire. The ultimate legacy of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette is therefore tragic and ironic. Their personal failings and political weaknesses led directly to the collapse of their ancient regime, but their deaths were the final political act that secured the revolution's survival. The blood shed on the scaffold paved the way for the Republic and ultimately for the Empire, proving that while the revolution succeeded in destroying the old order, the price of its success was the creation of a powerful new form of autocratic rule necessary to fill the monumental vacuum their downfall created. The sound of the falling guillotine blade was the final curtain call of one era and the definitive opening fanfare of the Napoleonic age.